2 years ago, the ABC drama series NYPD Blue premiered. It has become a rating success, drawing in millions of viewers each week with its compelling storylines and complex characters. In 1994, it was nominated for a record 26 Emmy nominations, winning 4. Last September, it proved itself again by upsetting NBC's ER and winning Best Dramatic Series. Joining me now is David Milch, executive producer and co-creator of the series, and Bill Clark, a former New York City homicide detective and the show's consulting producer. They are co-authors of True Blue, the real stories behind NYPD Blue, and we'll talk about this book as well as other things. I'm pleased to have both of them here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. The real stories behind NYPD. This really is based on your stories, right?
Those are cases that Bill worked, as well as an effort to talk a little bit about the genesis of the show and the difficulties we went through getting it on the air, and then some problems we had once we were on the air.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that. What do you do as a consulting producer? I mean, what's your role there?
Well, presently I'm involved in the whole process, from story meetings through working with the writers, through production, through on the set, dealing with the tone of the scene and the authenticity of how cops act, and into post-production. So.
Yeah. This is one proof that Bill needs an agent, because Bill does,
he does a lot more than that,
because he does an awful lot more than that. The whole sensibility of the show is
needs
always
Hollywood
Bill,
informed, doesn't it? Yeah. But it, in a sense, what's difficult about it? I mean, tell me, compare Hollywood with real life. Compare your stories that you knew and lived with what you see on the air.
Well, that's what makes my job really simple, is that we do it the way it happened, and it really happened. So it's not something that I have to worry about taking literary license and did I go too far. I mean, we really try to keep right on the money with it, and it's just a question of having actors act like the way cops would really act, and having the story told and the impact on the victims and their victims' families, try to get that feeling across that really was when I had the case.
Yeah. Why is the show successful, other than good acting, let's say, and good writing? What is it about the show?
Well, I
gives it a signature and an identity that attracts an audience.
Yeah, I think its heart is in the right place, Charlie. In no small part because of Bill, we portray people who are trying to do their jobs for more than the reasons that people ordinarily associate with cops. And as Bill points out, when we portray a crime, we try and show some of the results of that. And the effort to go into the emotional lives, I think, of all the participants might be why people respond to it.
You had to introduce this guy to Stephen Bochco, who was the king of Hollywood, certainly now, although he went through a little drought there when he tried to put roaches in the White House and have singing cops. What did you think of that series?
It's my boss. I thought it was a great show.
You loved it, didn't you?
I loved it.
Didn't know what millions of other Americans didn't. But you had to arrange a lunch with him.
Yes. And Stephen actually was very responsive, but Bill had... you know the Jack story, where you anticipate every disaster that can happen, so that and that was what was going through Bill's mind. So that by the time he actually got to meet Stephen, he was a nervous wreck. But in fact, I think I mentioned in the book that I encouraged Bill. He had been telling me about bosses he had who were pains in the neck and how they could screw up working on cases, dislocating his concerns about meeting Stephen. And I kept saying, Bill, he's not like that. Well, I finally got Bill talking about other bosses, and as we walked out of the restaurant afterwards, Stephen took my arm and held me back a couple paces so Bill couldn't hear me, and said, "Do not let this guy out of your sight."
And what was it you think he saw? Just the fact that Bill had been there, he had authenticity, he had a capacity to evoke...
forgive me. I think that what he brought in addition to all of those things, because there are a lot of ex-cops, is an enormous emotional commitment to the stories that he was telling, and that commitment translated itself into specificity and detail that you just couldn't get anywhere else. I mentioned that in the book that Bill's packed more than to the oath that he takes to uphold the Constitution. is with the victims of crime and their families, and he is so intent when he works on a case, and the importance that he ascribes to it is really very profound. And when he tells the stories, that's what radiates through it. It's almost like stealing for me, having heard Bill talk, to adapt the stories, because there's such passion at the bottom of it.
Did you want in this series to push, I mean, it's a terrible phrase to use now, it's such a cliche, push the edge of the envelope?
You know, I've told Stephen that no matter what else he accomplishes in his life, when he's arraigned at the bar of heaven, he's going to have to answer for the phrase pushing the envelope. That was actually much more Stephen's concern than mine.
He wanted to do it.
He wanted to do it.
He wants to break new ground. He wants to be on the frontier.
Yeah, that's all true, but he also had a very specific, practical understanding of the business that I don't. And what he realized was that our drama at 10 o'clock was dead unless it could compete with cable. That cable had simply taken that market, R-rated films, and that the only way to draw the audience back, at least to gain a threshold appeal,
was to be what?
Well, it was to do a show which credibly and legitimately embraced conventions which hadn't been seen on network television before in terms of language and nudity.
David Caruso.
My favorite subject.
Why?
No, I'm being ironic.
I listen.
David Caruso did an extraordinary job in his portrayal of the character of Kelly, but he was no fun at all to work with. His process, and to give him credit, I think of all the difficulties that he caused us on the set were the result of his process. He was trying to get to his character. But, you know, one of Fitzgerald's characters says, conduct can be founded on the hard rock or on the wet marshes. After a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. He made everyone...
After a certain point, it's time to deliver, is that what you're saying?
He made everyone so miserable that when he decided that he had a film career in the offering and wanted to get out of his contract, no one tried to impede his departure.
Including you.
Including me, although...
you didn't worry about it? You didn't worry about this guy was being cited as...
Yeah,
you know, the hottest dramatic star in television.
Sure, we
got all this money that's going to come your way if this thing doesn't.
Yeah, and Bill
stumble.
worried. Bill worried in particular because Bill saw his retirement going right out the window. But
were you more sympathetic, you think, to Caruso than?
No, actually, when I saw what the disruption he was causing the first season, I was the first one to. I don't know anything about the business, so I'm saying, why don't you just dump this guy?
You know, you're right. You got to like this guy.
You know, here's a guy who's making everybody's life miserable. Dump him. You know, we'll get another
simple,
guy.
isn't it?
And I was right.
Yeah,
we got rid of him, and we brought in a guy who's a sweetheart of a guy, a great
Jimmy
actor.
Smith is a sweetheart, isn't he?
He's a wonderful guy, a great human being, and he's a fine actor, and we're doing better than ever.
And he gives you new opportunities because of the character. All right, take a look. Set this clip up. We're going to see young Mr. Smits in action here. This is
from an episode where Sipowicz and Simone go upstate to interview a suspect, and it's based on a story that Bill told me when I was trying to get background from him on what cops do when they're in a strange town. It's an index of the complications of Bill's personality. He said, well, they do what anyone does. They go antiquing.
Right. Yeah, right.
And
they go to the library.
And they take their birds with them. And this may be what we're about to see.
In fact, this is Travels with Andy. Roll tape. Jimmy Smits, NYPD. You couldn't put on TV.
Yeah.
You know, I think specifically the story about the cops being kidnapped.
Right, that was one, and there's been some with babies and young children that are just too horrible to even get into. You know, that's the kind of things that we deal with and take to bed with us at night. You know, people wouldn't want to watch that on television. It's too tough. You know.
Why did you become a cop?
I guess I got to blame Jack Webb and the shows I grew up on as a kid. I lived near a police station, and in my neighborhood, being a cop was something special. You know, it was a working class.
The voice of authority.
Well, there's a mystery involved in policing, and watching cops go by in that car and seeing them act, and thinking that, watching the TV shows and seeing them on top locking up the bad guys. I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of bad guys. I mean, a lot of my friends died of drugs in later years or died in jail. There was, and then there was some of us that became cops. And,
Is Sipowicz modeled after you in any way? Is he you?
No. He's
in terms of the same thing that you'd give a character of sentiment. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. There are aspects of Sipowicz's personality that are similar to mine. It's no secret that I had a drug problem, and Sipowicz is a recovering alcoholic. I think I describe in the book that probably closer to the bottom lines of Sipowicz's nature, he's drawn much more on my father, who was the same type of complicated personality in that he was enormously driven and in some ways very emotionally isolated, and at the same time enormously generous. And at the depths of whatever behavior he was engaged in, you were always pulling for him. You could feel a soul reaching out, and I think that may be at the heart of why people like Sipowicz.
The soul reaching out.
A soul trying to, addicts sometimes talk about the committee. Yeah. There are all these voices that are going on in your head saying you're a bum, or you're no good, or you're this, or you're that. And what you want, and a lot of times I think why people take drugs, is to just quiet the committee down a little bit so your own voice can be heard. And I think what you see in Sipowicz is a man who's got a very active committee, whose own voice, when he's able to use it, is very kind and gentle. But he's got a lot of other people speaking through the same mic.
Yeah. What's your favorite story in here? What one resonates, touches, you like the best?
I guess, all of these stories, are kind of like heartbreaking, and they took a toll on me emotionally. I think the ones where our detectives help out somebody in trouble and go to their assistance and look after another cop or a relative or something like that. I spent an awful lot of time working hard not to arrest somebody while I was a policeman, and trying to keep them from getting that proverbial B number, as we call it, because you're arrested once, and I used to tell people for the rest of your life, every questionnaire you ever fill out, have you ever been arrested? It's a yes answer and an explanation. And a lot of times the reasons that their name crosses our desk, their intent was not to break the law. It's a mistake they made. Alcohol may take a part. And I really enjoyed giving people a break, as sometimes more than I did arresting. There are people I arrested for murder that I realized how the impact on their life, and they were goaded by somebody, and they...
You realize how people's lives, and while in the end you are responsible for your own life, the influences that can weigh in heavily to shape who you are and who you become.
This quick. If I don't know how many times in looking at a dead body I realized that seconds ago, minutes ago, this guy was alive, and he took a step to the left or the right, and his life was ended. And, sometimes a young person, I've done a lot of living in my life, and when I see young people die and thinking about all they're going to miss, that quick it happens.
And what did you think when you read about Mark Fuhrman and the LAPD, and what people were thinking and saying about police?
Well, there's two questions. There's the LAPD and there's Mark Fuhrman. Right. I mean, some of those detectives on that job, on the LAPD, did a fine job on that case. You cannot do something in a day, do as many things as those detectives have to do on one investigation with the tons of evidence that was involved in that case without making mistakes. The defense had a year to pick it apart. What Mark Fuhrman did is unconscionable. That's a different question altogether. Making a mistake when you're doing your job, that happens all the time.
So you're here to say that all the things that the defense pointed out in that particular trial of police work by the LAPD, that a lot of those things you could find in any major investigation of any murder that has taken place in any big city in America.
Absolutely, and I pride myself on my work, and I've made mistakes on many of them. If the one mistake they made was because they had so much evidence on that case, I mean, they felt, we call it in New York City a grounder. This is a grounder. The husband killed the wife and the boyfriend, who he thought was a boyfriend. And here's all this blood trail, there's blood here, there's blood there, there's a glove here, there's tons of evidence. They did a 30-minute interview with him and let him go on his merry way. They had him locked into an alibi, which wasn't even brought out in trial, what he had told those detectives.
Billy has made the point when we talk about the case that if O.J. Simpson had renounced his right to an attorney, which he did, in Billy's presence, they would have needed 6 tanks to get him out of that room before he had a confession. He just would not have let him go because he had said, I don't need a lawyer, and he would have stayed in that room until he confessed.
And he would have confessed. There's no doubt in my mind about it. He would have just been told, listen, this is a horrible crime here. This woman was viciously cut up, as was the fella. Something set you off, something she did. I would have transposed the blame onto her and try to get him to understand that I understand why you did it, but you've got to tell me so that I can go to bat for you.
You don't want to go into jail as a crazy man. You don't want people to think that you're, I mean, as many millions of people as admire you and look up to you, they're going to be enormously sympathetic, but you got to put this in context. You got to make people understand the way she provoked you. She was promiscuous. You were concerned about your children. And if you go at somebody, I mean, Billy is an expert at this for hours and hours and hours. And when it comes to it, when he finally says, okay, this is enough, you know, what Billy has said on many occasions is, you got to understand something. You did it, and you're not leaving the room until you give it up. Now, we can do it any way you want, but you must understand. And when it finally comes through to him that he's got no way out of that room, he has renounced his right to counsel. He's going to go for it, or he's going to stay in there the rest of his life. And eventually, he probably would have gone.
And every piece of that evidence that was there could have been thrown up against him. I mean, you would have just said, look at, you know, what are you kidding? There's not a jury in the world, as it turned out there was, not a jury in the world that would acquit with this much evidence. Try to explain away what happened. I mean, I've done it. That's what I did for 17 years in homicide, getting people to confess to murder. And with far less evidence that they had there, sometimes no evidence. And when the minute they confess, I go 25 to life to myself, because that's what it was.
One of the things that Billy, you know, you asked about Mark Furman, and one of the things that I'm very proud of in the show is that for example, in the case of Sipowicz, that people get to understand cops in the round. Every cop is the product of his environment, black or white. Are there racists of both stripes in the departments? Absolutely. But what people ought to understand, and what Furman has permitted people to misunderstand, is that the vast majority of cops, some of whom do have racist impulses, devote themselves to neutralizing the effect of that racism. For them, it's a point of pride to do their job fairly, whatever their personal feelings are. And what this jerk has made it possible is for people to feed this myth that, yeah, that's what cops are really like. Secretly, you give them a chance. They all hate blacks, and they'll screw them.
Sure. No. I hear you loudly, but let me just come back to this point.
Me.
No. There's no question in your mind. After O.J. Simpson had renounced or would have waived the right to counsel, said, I don't need a lawyer, and didn't do it, you could have gotten him to confess.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's my opinion, but I mean, I would think based on all of the pieces of evidence.
I mean, when you say, what is it you're going to say to this guy other than lay the evidence out there?
I had a case with a blood trail 2 weeks prior to the O.J. Simpson case. There was no relationship between the perpetrator, if you will, and the deceased, but it was a man and a woman over a jealous thing. This guy wound up cutting him up. The woman was stabbed somewhat over 30 times, and the guy was stabbed over 60 times. This guy was an ex-con. He was on parole. The way I approached him was that to do this, something had to set you off. I mean, this was not just, you didn't just kill him. You cut them up into pieces. I mean, there's something that they had to do that made you go off this way. And in fact, what he wound up telling me was that when he cut them, when he cut the first one, he realized he was going back to jail. He knew that he had made a mistake. And in his frustration, he just started hacking them up. And he lost it. He says, I just lost it, and I went through there. And he says afterwards, there was a blood trail through the whole apartment, lamps knocked over. And he said, I was like a caged lion, and I knew I had done wrong. And he got out of there, and yet when I picked him up, he had which was a few days later, he had the story lined up. And it was just a question. I told him, I've got evidence. With O.J., there was so much evidence I could have just laid down in front of him that he would have felt it. There's no doubt I could convict him.
But I think the psychology, because people will point to certain differences in circumstance between O.J. and this guy. Yeah. This guy said, well, I'm going back to jail. O.J. didn't think he was going back to jail. But what Billy's gift is to identify in every situation what it is that will make the man feel, A, that he is emotionally subordinate to Bill, that Bill has an indomitable will, and B, that Bill is ultimately sympathetic to him. And that combination, being able to tune it with sexual deviance to make them understand, look, I could do that. I could do that. And no matter how sickened you are by it, to the guy who killed and sodomized unspeakably this kid, Bill wound up thinking that Bill was his best friend, and Bill was devastated by having gotten the confession by what he had to do. With Simpson, what he would have had to project was that he understood the enormous pressure this guy was under, that here he was a star, that he wasn't understood by his own race, that he wasn't understood by the white race, that this girl failed to appreciate him. And at the same time, when Simpson at a certain point would feel himself at risk and say enough, then as sympathetically as possible to say to him, you got to understand something. That's no longer in the game. You don't get to say enough. I'll understand what you did, but you're not getting out of the room. And then if physical force becomes necessary, people have to understand that
if physical force becomes necessary
to establish, simply to establish dominance. And in the case of O.J. Simpson, I mean, Bill's a pretty tough guy, but O.J. Simpson's a pretty tough guy too. But what you have to do there, I would think, is simply exhaust him. You know, well, just make him understand that physically he's not going to be able to leave that environment.
I don't even think he you know, tougher guys than him, and I'm giving him the credit that he's probably a very tough guy. That never becomes an issue. He would be told that his right to leave is gone. He waived it in front of an attorney, and that'd be it. You know, the thing is, when I finish an interrogation with a guy, and many times it goes through confrontational times, and there is physical things that go on. By the time I get that confession, I'm the best friend that guy has in the world. I'm the only one in the world that understands why he did what he did. He doesn't want me to leave the room.
The confession that he's talking about in the Flowers case, this man said, that's the nicest man I've ever met in my life, the killer, and I don't want him to leave. I want him to stay with me through the whole course of being booked.
The real stories behind NYPD Blue, True Blue. David Milch and Detective Bill Clark, NYPD's Blues co-creator and creative consultant. Thank you both. Pleasure to meet both of you.
Thank you.
You could probably help me do this program, couldn't you? That's kind of a consultant to me. Don't go yet.
I guess I won't be going to dinner at OJ's.
No, you will not. You will not be over at Rockingham anytime soon.
Actually, I go by. We have detectives out all the time.
Yeah?
And part of the tour package is a shot past Rockingham and Bundy.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.